Hello, and welcome to the Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. My name is Ryan, and I am a self-proclaimed Calvin and Hobbes superfan and expert.
And my name is also Ryan, although most people call me Indy.
Hello and welcome back. Now you're probably used to hearing Ryan's voice to start the episode, but I'll be taking point on this one. Now, before we begin, we just want to say that we are not affiliated with Bill Watterson or Universal Press Syndicate, so we don't have the rights to these strips, and we won't be able to show them on any visual versions of the podcast. However, as always, we'll include a blog post with references to every strip we talk about, so you can look them up in the books if you have them, or on gocomics.com if you have a subscription.
So, with that being said, let's get right in. Today, we're talking about philosophy in Calvin and Hobbes. There's actually quite a few philosophical themes and ideas that appear in the strip in various forms. We might not be able to cover all of them, but we could still do a survey of a lot of the bigger concepts. So to start, Ryan, what would you say the sort of stereotypical philosophy question, maybe even the stereotypical philosophy question?
So I have two thoughts on that come from Calvin and Hobbes, and I'm sure we'll address this later, but Calvin's question in class one time, he asks, what's the point of human existence? And then on a similar note, there's a time where Calvin quotes Paul Gauguin and says, whence do we come? What are we? Where are we going? So just kind of that flavor. Why are we here? What's the point of all this?
Exactly. Now, I'll also point out, if you don't know who Paul Gauguin is, that's okay, because neither does Calvin. He ends the strip by saying, by the way, who the heck was Paul Gauguin anyway? Okay.
I will admit, I don't really know who Gauguin is. I've heard of him, but
yeah, he was actually an artist.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, that's what I was thinking, but that's about all I know about it.
yeah, I mean, I know a little bit more, but anyway, that's beside the point. But I would agree. So this topic, probably the most stereotypical philosophical question, what is the meaning of life? Or as you put it, what's the point of human existence? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And this topic gets maybe a surprising amount of attention in the strip, given that it's about a 6-year-old boy and his tiger and their imaginary adventures. But like we mentioned before, this is probably part of why the strip is so meaningful. The philosophical content and the themes presented in an accessible way.
Yeah, the fact that it's funny, but it's not merely funny. Like the funny draws people to it, but they stay in part because it's meaningful.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's just on sort of a personal note, when I was prepping for this episode, like obviously I knew there was a lot of philosophical content in Calvin and Hobbes, but it almost surprised me how much I found when I was going through it, specifically looking for it too. So yeah, there's definitely a lot there. Now, as far as the meaning of life, this question actually gets asked more or less explicitly. So in one early strip, Calvin poses this to Hobbes, but Hobbes isn't that interested in the discussion this time. So Calvin says, why are we here? And then, well, because we walked here. No. I mean on Earth, because Earth can support life. No, I mean, why are we here and why do we exist? Because we were born. So Calvin finally says, forget it. And Hobbes says, I will, thank you.
I love that they both have annoyed expressions on their faces.
Yeah.
Just completely talking past each other.
Exactly. They're both mad at each other. And again, as a philosopher myself, I just have to laugh, because this is either with maybe introductory students or just people you talk to. It's like, well, no, I'm trying to ask this. Yeah, I find that pretty funny myself. That being said, there are times when Hobbes does entertain the question. So a different strip, he says, oh, I wonder why man was put on Earth. What's our purpose? Why are we here? And what is Hobbes' answer?
Tiger food. He gives Calvin this great cheeky smile afterwards too, which incidentally, that strip is the one that Watterson chose to highlight in the 10th anniversary book when discussing Hobbes' character. Like, that's, to him, I guess, quintessential Hobbes.
Yeah, which that makes sense. I mean, it kind of fits with the dim view of human nature. It's like, well, what else would humans be for? They're not really good for anything. Certainly not as good as cats, like tigers are. So
Well, obviously.
So similarly, Hobbes gives another answer like this. So Calvin's even more reflective at this point. He's saying, well, I feel like the technology and modern conveniences we have separated us from nature. And he's actually very formal about this. He's like, so I would like to ask you, Hobbes, as a wild animal who's closer to nature, what is the point of existence? And again, what is Hobbes' answer?
We're here to devour each other alive.
Yes. So Calvin sees this as a pretty bleak point of view, but I mean, Hobbes doesn't seem to see it as bleak.
Yeah, it seems like he just takes it in stride. Obviously, that's why we're here. We're here to eat each other.
Yeah, like what do you mean? That's the point of all existence, to devour each other alive. Okay, so you ask a tiger this thing, that's the kind of answer you get.
Although I will say, I don't know about the characterization of Hobbes as a wild animal. I mean, he does like his comforts.
That's true. So that's a funny kind of juxtaposition in this strip. Like you've got the part of Hobbes that talks about being in the jungle and, oh, you wouldn't last 5 seconds if you were in the jungle. But then when Calvin tries to ask him, like, well, how would we cook food? He's like, well, if it's a box of rigatoni noodles, you'd put on some water, that kind of thing. So
And he's referring to the rigatoni as prey specifically, I think.
that's right. She's like, well, it depends on what kind of prey it was. Like, oh, I don't care, choose anything. Well, if it's rigatoni noodles and so
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. So Hobbes is a little schizophrenic almost in a way. Like he vacillates between, oh, I'm this fierce jungle predator and I like to be comforted and just lay
I want
around.
my tummy rubbed.
Yes, and I'll snarl at you if you stop. So we get this kind of dynamic where Calvin wants to know what the point of human existence is. Hobbes gives what humans would probably see as unsatisfying answers. On the other hand, there's at least some times when Calvin also has a bleak outlook. And so Calvin at one point says, you know, the people's problem is they don't look at the big picture. And do you remember what the big picture is that he thinks people don't recognize?
So I don't know if I have the exact strip, but I know there's one where he talks about in class, given that we're all just going to die, why do we have to learn about integers? And I think there's one where he's talking about, on a similar note, the Earth is finite. I don't remember exactly what he says, but eventually we'll become a cold, lifeless ball, and basically there's no point to it all.
Yeah, so that's the one I was thinking of more. The other one is good too, but yeah. So I think I have the exact quote here. So Hobbes wants to know what is the big picture. He says, "Eventually, we're all going to die. Our species will go extinct. The sun will explode, and the universe will collapse. Existence is not only temporary; it's pointless. We're all doomed, and worse, nothing matters."
That is pretty bleak.
Yeah, that might even be worse than the we're just here for tiger food or to devour each other alive. That's pretty severe.
Yeah.
Now, in other ships, though, neither one of them really seems so sure. And this is one that I find particularly pensive. And this actually just takes place on a sidewalk. So Calvin and Hobbes are standing there, and Calvin sort of starts waxing poetic. He says, well, life is like being in this square. We start at one crack, and then we'll eventually end at the other one. And in the middle of it, we have to ask ourselves, am I making the most of these precious few footsteps? And it's, fairly profound, especially for a 6-year-old.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, that is really profound and worth thinking about, am I doing anything with my life that will make a difference in someone else's life and that sort of thing. I also wonder what Calvin thinks the squares both before and after the life square represent. Does he believe in an afterlife and stuff like that? And we may talk about that either later in this episode or another episode, but I just wonder what Calvin thinks about that.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And that's not something I thought of till you brought it up. But yeah, that's an interesting question. So it's an intriguing metaphor, and it's a little haunting too, because it is this profound thought, but we don't get an answer. I mean, not even really speculation. It's just sort of the lingering question, what are we doing with our lives and is it meaningful?
And I will note that Calvin in that strip is still standing in that same square of sidewalk, presumably several hours later at night, just wrestling with this idea and maybe not wanting to leave that square of sidewalk for fear of what might come next.
Exactly. And that's also reminiscent of another one, which is, it's not explicitly about the meaning of life, but they're looking at their reflections in a puddle. And one of them said, I guess it's Calvin, who says, oh, do you ever think, what if the person in the puddle is real and you're just a reflection of them? And then Hobbes says, well, if that's true, then you disappear as soon as they moved away from the puddle. And then this time too, we see him later at night with this kind of, disturbed expression on his face, just kind of staring at the puddle.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, sometimes we get definite answers that are bleak. Sometimes we get questions without answers. Sometimes we just get the desire for the answers. So you mentioned before that in school he wanted to know the point of human existence. He also goes on to say, well, I'd like to have the issue resolved before spending any more energy on this assignment. So yeah, I gotta say, same Calvin. I mean, it's like, well, is it really important to do this assignment compared with a question like that? Probably not. That's why I became a philosopher. I don't know.
Kind of makes me think of Calvin's dad too, that sometimes he'll say things like, nobody ever lay on their deathbed wishing they spent more time in the office and stuff like that, just
That's
thinking
true.
about what's really important. Although his perspective on that changes when Calvin is doing what Calvin's doing.
That's true. Yeah, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I think he's thinking to himself, oh yeah, nothing would happen if I took the day off. I could read and spend time with Calvin, and then Calvin is running away from the consequences of his dramatic misbehavior. And then I think we see him at his desk later, like whistling to himself. So
Yeah. I might be mixing a couple up, but I think that's the one where Calvin is like, hi, Dad, bye, Dad. And then Mom is in a towel soaking wet. Calvin, you come back here and pick every one of those dead bugs out of my shampoo right now. And then Dad is much happier to be at work.
yeah, that changed his whole outlook. I can almost imagine like, well, gotta go to work. Bye. So there's another strip where they're going down the hill on the wagon, and this actually becomes a recurring metaphor. So usually they're having a fairly deep discussion while going on the wagon, and it usually ends calamitously, which is kind of an illustration in a lot of cases what's going on. Now, in this particular one, Calvin talks about how we all want meaning in our lives, but then he wonders whether maybe there is no meaning. What if life is fundamentally absurd? And then considering this, he then poses this question. He says, well, what would be worse if nothing mattered or if everything mattered? And at this point, they're careening off of the cliff in the wagon, which is usually how these things end.
Yep, there's a lot of wagon strips that do that and get very philosophical. And I will say, for my part, I think it would be worse if nothing mattered. That's my personal view of it.
All right. How so?
I just feel like I would like my life to have meaning. And, if the choices are nothing matters or everything matters does put some weight on you where you've got to be careful about everything you do. But the idea that nothing matters just makes me depressed. And I feel like that would be worse.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I would also tend to answer that, yeah, it would be worse if nothing mattered than if everything mattered.
Yeah.
That being said, there are philosophers who think that we create our own meaning to life. And so it's common to take a view that there's no sort of internal meaning or intrinsic meaning, but there's a school of thought in which you think, well, if nothing mattered, you'd still have the same amount of weight, if not more, because now it's incumbent on you to make your life matter.
Right. But what I would argue there is if you can make your life matter, then you can't really say that nothing matters. Like,
yeah,
the idea, if you're saying nothing matters, that to me suggests that no matter what you do, you can't give your life meaning. And that I find extremely depressing.
Yes, I would agree with that. So, yeah. But in any case, Calvin poses this fairly interesting question, and more deep than we have time to go into here, obviously. But yeah.
Okay,
but,
listeners, for the next 5 hours, we're going to be discussing.
Just
it's not like there are entire courses devoted to these sorts of subjects or anything.
Right. And just to give the listeners a little behind the scenes look, it's like we've had to cut down a lot of material that could have gone in this. So anyway, we're doing kind of a survey of some philosophical themes in Calvin and Hobbes. On that point, there's two strips in particular that I think are especially poignant and provide some of the best discussion of questions about the meaning of life in Calvin and Hobbes. And one of them is actually a whole story arc. And Ryan, I think you can probably guess which one I mean. A lot of our listeners can probably guess what I'm about to say too. And I'm thinking of the little raccoon story.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So Calvin assumes that his mom will be able to help save this baby raccoon that he finds injured in the woods. I think Hobbes even questions about this, like, well, will your mom be able to help? And he says, like, well, sure, you can't get to be mom if you don't know how to fix things just right. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's a little heart wrenching just on its own there. But yeah, so she and later Calvin's dad do what they can for the baby raccoon, but later Calvin's heart is broken because the raccoon doesn't make it. I mean,
Yeah.
this is one of the maybe the most crying we ever see Calvin do, except for one other potential exception. I think maybe you could argue that when he's afraid that Hobbes has been stolen during the break-in arc,
That's
like
what I was thinking of.
yeah, we don't see him sort of sobbing as much, but you do see him crying, and so you might argue, okay, maybe that's more. But in any case, he bursts into tears when he hears the raccoon pass away. And just as a side note, I think we get a really nice strip of his dad comforting him at this point, which I don't know. We talked about this in the dad episode about how even though there's so much, like, he misbehaves so much and there's so much conflict there, there really is this loving relationship. And I think that's another instance of that. We see his dad being very tender towards him in this moment. But
Yeah,
anyway,
giving him a hug. Yeah.
yeah. So that's just a little aside. But in any case, so the raccoon doesn't make it, and Calvin's obviously very broken up about this. And near the end, this is actually that evening, I suppose, he and Hobbes are in bed, and Calvin starts reflecting, and he's saying, well, I've been thinking about the little raccoon. What's the point of putting him here and taking him back so soon? And then he eventually says, it's either mean or it's arbitrary, and either way, I've got the heebie-jeebies. So yeah, I think this is something we can all relate to. So it's not explicitly about the meaning of life, but it does touch on this question, like, is there meaning to life in general? Is there a reason for the things that happen? And if so, is the reason cruel somehow? And there's one other thing on this that I think is especially worth noting, and that's after he says this, they're actually hiding under the bed. And Hobbes says, like, why is it always night when we talk about these things? And so, it adds a little bit of levity. But I think it's worth noting that they're hiding under the bed where typically there's monsters. So
Right.
that would be crazy to go under your bed at night. We know there's monsters there, but
We've talked to them. They have
yeah,
names.
they've talked to us. Yeah, so we know they're trying to devour us. But at this point, they're hiding under the bed because the monsters aren't under the bed. It's the world itself that is monstrous at this point.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that until you pointed that out. I like it.
Yeah, I actually hadn't either too until really recently while prepping for this episode. It kind of occurred to me. It's like, well, that's weird. They're under the bed, and I thought, well, that's because that's not where the monsters are now. It's
Yeah.
Calvin's questioning, why is the world so monstrous that it would take this innocent creature and just take him away again so soon?
Yeah. It's very thoughtful for a 6-year-old.
Yeah. So that's again, I mean, we don't get an answer to this question, but that's part of the point, right? The purpose is posing it in the first place is part of what is valuable.
Right.
Now, a much later strip touches on similar issues, though it's still sad, but it's more pensive overall. And this is just a similar strip. I believe it's a Sunday strip, so there's several panels of it. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is the dead bird strip. And so Calvin and Hobbes find what looks to be a sparrow or maybe a finch that's dead on the ground, and they talk about how beautiful and delicate it is. And again, they kind of reflect on the fragility of life and the ruthlessness of nature. And then, they said, but we can't just think about that, or you'd never be able to do anything to go on with your daily life. You can't just spend all your time thinking about how cruel and heartbreaking nature can be. And then at the end, Calvin says, I suppose it will all make sense when we grow up. And Hobbes replies, no doubt.
Yeah, which I'm stating the obvious here, but I don't think it does all make sense when we grow up. But I can certainly see a kid thinking that. It kind of reminds me of a couple of other things. There's, Calvin being surprised that there's no qualifying exam to be dad and stuff like that. It also reminds me of a strip where Calvin says to Hobbes that it's strange that we laugh at absurdity, that we think it's funny, and he wonders why that is. And Hobbes comments that if we couldn't laugh at things that don't make sense, we couldn't react to a lot of life, which is kind of a funny point, but also kind of an interesting one. That, oh yeah, that's a good point, Hobbes.
Yeah, it is. And I think Calvin even says at the end, I can't tell if that's funny or really scary, which
Yeah,
a little of both, which again is kind of the point being made there. Like to maybe, if not all of life, maybe a lot of life is fundamentally absurd, and we have to react to it in some way, still find a way to make meaning out of that or find what meaning there is. Yeah, I would agree. It also reminds me, I think there's an interesting parallel here. The one, again, in the break-in arc, Calvin's dad actually talks about this. He
oh
says,
yeah,
when I was young, I assumed that, I think he says it in two ways. I think first his parents, it's like I always trusted them to handle everything, and it never occurred to me they might not know how.
hmm
And that he also thought, grown-ups would automatically know what to do in any given situation. When you grow up, it's like, oh, well, now I know how to handle whatever. As we all do, he has to be disillusioned about this, and it's sad, right? He even says, I wouldn't have been in such a rush to grow up if I'd known how much of it was going to be ad-libbed.
it's indeed Calvin's dad, indeed.
Yeah, it turns out this is a hard lesson. So, okay, well, now that we're all thoroughly depressed, let's move
Yes,
on to a different part of philosophy, Calvin and Hobbes. Yeah. So listen to our podcast. We'll talk about dying baby raccoons, how there might not be meaning to life, and how you won't know how to do anything to handle your problems. There you go.
all right. Well, listeners, thank you for
Yay.
tuning in.
So let's move on a little bit, though. So again, this is about philosophy and Calvin and Hobbes. And we've talked before about how Calvin is named after the theologian John Calvin, who believed in the concept of predestination. And
Right.
there's actually a lot of references throughout Calvin and Hobbes to questions about God, theology, and faith. So let's start with that last one. And Ryan, if you had to guess, when was the first Calvin and Hobbes strip that talks about fate?
So the one that comes to mind is Calvin and Hobbes are riding in a wagon, and Calvin just kind of out of nowhere asks Hobbes, "Do you believe in fate?" And I think Hobbes says something like, "You mean that our lives are controlled by the stars," or something like that. And then as they're careening off a bridge into the water, I think it's Calvin that says, "What a scary thought."
Yeah, exactly. So that comes very early too. It's actually the 13th strip that was ever printed for Calvin and Hobbes.
Okay. I wouldn't have pegged it quite that early. All right.
I wouldn't have either. I was kind of surprised to find that. So yeah, and I know we had talked before about, so we say he's named after John Calvin, and then there's been some question of whether, well, was he really, or was this just a coincidence? And I think this is pretty good evidence that he was. I mean, not just, that would be quite the coincidence if,
Yeah. Yeah, I know that there's some argument that since he was originally named Marvin, that changing his name to Calvin was not as significant as Bill Watterson might claim. But I think Bill Watterson was being thoughtful about it.
yeah, I mean, for this early, so when the first couple of weeks of the strip's run, he's specifically talking about fate, and he uses the term predestination specifically too.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. Well, and if it's the first couple weeks of strips, I mean, I think he had to submit a month's worth of strips before the thing even got picked up by, even for, a second look by a syndicate. So
that would make sense.
he must have had that on paper before the strip was ever syndicated.
Yeah, so I don't know. I feel like we can declare that debate settled. I think he definitely was named after John Calvin. I mean, these themes are directly imported into the strip in this way. So
All right, so it turns out Watterson was in fact telling the truth.
yeah, we got your back, buddy. Yeah, so this is a recurring theme in this strip, and there's a another early one where he doesn't use the term predestination exactly, but now he talks about the stars in particular. He says, do you think our destinies are controlled by the stars? And this time Hobbes has an answer for it.
Yeah, Hobbes does not think that our lives are controlled by the stars. He thinks we're free to do what we want.
Right. And then Calvin says, well, not to hear mom and dad tell it. So, okay, fair point.
Fair
And
point.
yeah, but later there's a whole story arc about this, and we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, but in a lot of ways, life probably does seem like a kind of oppressive fate to Calvin. And here's what I mean by this. So I think a good example is there's one strip where he's waiting at the bus stop in a total downpour. And he asks, I think he says this out loud. I mean, there's no one around to hear it, but he says, why in the world am I waiting in the pouring rain for the school bus to take me somewhere I don't even want to go? And there's no particular answer forthcoming to this question. Yeah, but when you're 6 years old in particular, a lot of your life is probably like that. So we see a lot of strips in which Calvin can't just run around and do what he wants, or maybe just slump in a chair and watch TV. And he seems to feel this as a sort of tyranny that's being imposed on him.
Yeah, he even uses that word specifically in some cases, though I'm thinking of, there's a time where he's doing homework and then he kind of narrates, mild-mannered Calvin is stuck in his room on a beautiful day doing homework. It's tyranny. And of course, Stupendous Man eventually swoops in to save the day, or at least attempt to. And it only just occurred to me when preparing for this episode that in the same way that Spaceman Spiff could maybe be part of Calvin's mechanism to cope with, the difficulties of the world, especially when Hobbes isn't around, that Stupendous Man could be partly his way of fighting against this tyranny of, all these rules that he has to follow that he doesn't want to.
I totally agree. And there's another Stupendous Man strip where it's similar, and I think it's like some fiend is threatening to enact a totalitarian system of rule, and the totalitarian system of rule, I think, is another example of like him being forced to do his homework or a chore or something. And so yeah, these aren't just annoyances or things you don't like. They're tyrannical and totalitarian. So yeah, of course you need a superhero to fight against this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Calvin kind of fuels this weight of fate oppressing him in this way. That being said, there are actually some times when Calvin seems to like the idea of fate. So before, he had asked Hobbes whether he thought our destinies were controlled by the stars. Later, he specifically decides he believes that they are, because life's a lot more fun when you're not responsible for your actions. So he doesn't like being told what to do, but he does like the idea that he's not responsible for the things he does.
That's interesting that it's taking the stance that you can't have it both ways. If you want to not be told what to do, you also have to take responsibility for what you do.
Right. And so it's kind of a parallel to the question about meaning, right? So there's a little bit of what I was suggesting before. So even if you don't think there's something else giving meaning to your life, then now you have the responsibility of giving meaning to your life. Maybe you do either way. So it could be that there's sort of external objective or whatever factors or forces that would give your life meaning, but you have to choose to embrace them in some way, or act in such a way that brings this about. So it's not necessarily a binary in that sense, but I think this is another kind of dimension of the same thing. So Calvin doesn't like fate in one sense, but there's another in which he does. There's another strip that has a similar theme, right? So here he actually uses that terminology. He says he's decided to be a fatalist because anything bad that happens isn't his fault. And I think we've talked about this before, maybe even in our first episode.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he doesn't like when this is used against him, because so Hobbes trips him into the mud. Too bad you were fated to do that. That wasn't fate.
Well, are you a fatalist or not, Calvin?
Yeah, it turns out, yeah, so, like you said, you can't have it both ways. Yeah, so Hobbes is fairly quick to give Calvin fairly deserved comeuppance in these sorts of situations, and I guess in philosophy we would call this isn't exactly the same thing, but we call it a reductio ad absurdum, where you say, you show that a person's ideas would lead to a contradiction, and so then that's how you disprove their argument. So this is kind of similar. So we're saying, well, if you really believe this, you would have to agree that this, which is really bad for you, and you don't want to. So okay, so your philosophy or your ideas are inconsistent in this way.
Yeah. So either you're wrong or you don't actually believe, even if you're right, you don't actually believe it.
Right. So Hobbes is quick to show this to Calvin. Actually, I should say illustrate, because he does it very practically by having Calvin suffer or fall in the mud or what have you.
Right.
But as we said, or as I alluded before, the biggest example of fate in Calvin and Hobbes has got to be the horoscope arc that appears in The Days Are Just.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I have to think that Watterson's making fun of the whole idea of horoscopes from the very beginning. So we get this great line where Calvin, after saying he believes in horoscopes, he says, "It only makes sense that every facet of our daily lives should depend on the position of celestial bodies hundreds of millions of miles away."
Absolutely. Yeah. Flawless
Yeah.
logic.
Yeah. How could you not believe that? It sounds like it makes so much sense. Yeah.
I'll also point out, just to be pedantic, that some of these celestial bodies are way farther away than that. So,
That's true.
if
not
Jupiter
only
has no effect.
Yeah. I mean, technically he's right. I guess he could have said dozens of miles away and it would still be true. It's just it doesn't.
Yeah, it's true. They are all hundreds of millions of miles away.
Yeah, that's like there are over 10 stars in our galaxy. It's like, well, yeah.
Well, you're not wrong.
Yeah, it doesn't quite capture the whole scope of it, or even the grandeur, we might say. But in any case, yeah. So Calvin decides that he believes in horoscopes. There is some indication that he's not just being flippant, though, because at one point he talks about it as if it were a science. He's like, well, this is based on planets and stars, right? What kind of a science is this? So it's not totally crazy the way he thinks about it, but the way he says that sure makes me think that we're being set up in that way here.
I will point out that at one point Hobbes observes that the astrologer must have been looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
That's right. So that's a common problem, it turns out. So if your horoscope is right, that may be what was happening.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's a little anticipatory. So as you can probably guess from this, things don't go as Calvin expects them to. So his horoscope says he will have many of his key policies implemented, and I think it's especially if he asserts them in a confident manner.
Correct.
Now, yeah, his mom is not impressed with this, though, is she?
No. Hobbes asks what his key policies are, and Calvin says, oh, no homework, no baths, stay up later, things like that. And then Hobbes says, here comes your mom, and it looks like she has a bone to pick with the moon. And Calvin says, ha, watch me assert my views in a confident manner. And I will leave it as an exercise to the reader to guess how that goes.
Yes. So the next day, then, he gets a new horoscope, and he thinks, well, maybe that'll print a retraction and an apology for the previous horoscope, where despite asserting his views in a confident manner, his key policies were not implemented. It doesn't, but he thinks, all right, well, maybe there were different key policies than a certain one, or maybe the new one will be better. But now this one's even worse, because what is this horoscope?
It's like lucky day for love, big dividends, something like that. And Hobbes thinks he knows what the big dividends are when Calvin starts talking about Susie.
It's like, oh, woo-hoo-hoo, we can guess what this is. Like, no.
Yeah. Calvin tells Susie, I don't want any big dividends, got it? And Susie's like, what?
Oh, yeah. This whole thing is great, too, because I think this is another case where Calvin's dad is glad to go to work, because we first get, him running away from his mom. It's like, no, don't make me go to school. I'm irresistible to the opposite sex today. I don't want kisses from Susie. I hate Susie. No, don't make me go. And then, they're chasing all around the house, and his mom's like, dear, grab a leg. And yeah, so that's great. And then probably even better, he's then at the bus stop waiting. Susie comes up. He's like, no, stay away from me. I don't want any kisses. He's like, huh? He's like, oh, thank goodness, the school bus came. I'm free. Yay, I'm off to school. Hooray. And if you ever thought that Calvin would ever say something like that,
Yeah, well, I guess we know what his priorities are then.
that's true. So he, as much as he hates school, he hates the thought of getting kissed by Susie more.
Yes.
Except sometimes, which we probably won't get to in this episode, but
There's a
arguably,
certain side of Calvin.
yes, yeah, a very specific side of Calvin that doesn't hate that idea. But for the most part, Calvin is completely freaked out about this, so much so that he's ecstatic that he's off to school on the school bus.
Yeah, and Susie says something like, the way Calvin's brain is wired, you can almost hear the fuses blowing.
Yes, yeah, that's another funny thing too. Like you said, she's just standing there going, "What? What? What?" Like she's no
What?
clue what's going on, which kind of makes me think sometimes, like, if you thought about this strip from other people's point of view, it must be sort of funny and sort of terrifying or just confusing too, because everything that Calvin does, or a counterpart of Calvin, let's say, makes perfect sense from Calvin's point of view. But
Right.
everyone else, this must be madness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we even get a few strips from other people's point of view, like another Stupendous Man one where Susie comes and knocks on Calvin's door and he opens the door and he's like, Calvin's a fool, mortal female. He's doing his whole Stupendous Man shtick and Susie is just completely confused. And then, Calvin shuts the door and flies off. And I don't remember exactly Susie's remark at the end, but it's, again, something like, I live in such a weird neighborhood, something to that effect.
Yeah, it's also, there's a similar one, not with Stupendous Man, but it's Calvin fighting with his bike, and he's hiding behind a tree, and he pulls Susie down. It's like, I'm gonna cut all my bike spokes in two, and if you never saw me today, got it? And then he dashes off. She's just like, yeah, I think she says, our class voted Calvin the most likely to be seen on the news someday.
Yes.
But in any case, so yeah, Calvin is freaked out that this horoscope might come true and he'll get big love dividends from Susie. He's irresistible to the opposite sex. She won't be able to control herself from smooching him. But it turns out he's relieved. Not only does she not smooch him, after he puts a worm in her hair, she kicks him and knocks him down.
Yeah, I believe she kicks him in the shins even, right?
Yeah, which that sounds really painful.
That hurts.
Yeah, shins are a surprisingly sensitive area.
But he's happy about all this. He's like,
oh, yeah, he's
I'm
like,
free.
Thank goodness. Yeah. So at this point, well, I guess the horoscopes don't really come true. And it's something like, oh, we can just choose to do whatever we want, but then we see him in the bathtub. Well, the paper should print Mom's daily predictions. Those sure come true.
Which goes back to that earlier strip where he says not to hear Mom and Dad tell it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you can see this later one as just like an expansion of that first one.
Yeah.
It's almost like, because the first one was very early. I think even in just Calvin and Hobbes, the first collection, not
yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so then much later we get this very expanded version of it, which is kind of cool to see, like an older idea that's then developed into something more extensive.
Yeah.
Right. So Calvin, based on this, decides to give up on the whole fate, astrology, whatever thing, kind of, but then he backslides in a later strip. So he doesn't use the word fate in this one, but he starts talking about luck. And this is another wagon ride. So he's explaining to Hobbes how, you're either born lucky or you're born unlucky, and there's nothing you can do about it. And then right before they go off the cliff this time, Hobbes bails out of the wagon, Calvin flies off in it, just like yesterday.
Yeah, so kind of not so subtly alluding to the idea that you can kind of control your luck by your actions.
Right, and it's the fatalistic attitude itself that makes the self-fulfilling prophecy here. It's like, oh man, I was so unlucky that doing this thing that I have every reason to know would end this way, and taking no steps to change it ended in that way again.
Right.
So we'll see some more fatalistic themes in a different context later. But first, let's talk about the other aspect of predestination specifically, which of course would be God. Now, there's a few direct references to God or theology, and they occur throughout the life of the strip. And one early one that I would say is kind of fascinating just in terms of Calvin's outlook and because of the historical Calvin he's named after. And I think Hobbes actually initiates this. So Hobbes says, "Do you think there's a God?" And do you remember what Calvin's reply is?
Well, if I'm thinking of the right strip, he says, "Well, somebody's out to get me," which
Exactly.
I found
Yeah.
that to be a pretty bleak outlook on that. I don't know that.
Yeah, we're back to the bleakness again. I wonder too if this idea kind of informs Calvin's imagination in the strip where he's playing with his tinker toys. So this is one we've talked about before a little bit. I think maybe in the layout episode, because
Yeah, when we talked about Sunday strips.
yeah, and this we mentioned this is one where Bill Watterson said that he wished he could have done this in a different layout because he felt like he never achieved what he really had in mind, which I think the way it turned out is actually still very cool the way he did
Agreed.
it. I mean, it'd also be awesome to see what he originally thought too. But in any case, so this is the one where, Calvin's imagining himself as a god, but then this takes a poor turn for the supposed people he's a god of here. So it's but Calvin's not a kind and loving God. Calvin's one of the old gods. Yes, Calvin is a god of the underworld. The puny inhabitants of earth displease him, which, yeah, that's a little scary, but I think,
You gotta wonder what's going through his head there a little bit.
yeah, I mean, this is, I guess, most charitably, we could just call this a power fantasy, but it's too bad that he wants to use that to inflict suffering on the puny inhabitants of earth.
Right.
Uh, that said, it's also interesting because I think arguably you could say that in Calvinism, something like this would be presumed to happen. The idea of predestination is that there's nothing you can do to affect your ultimate fate, and there's not even really much of a reason for it. It's just God chooses some people to be among the elect and they're destined for glory and happiness, and then he chooses some people that are not and they're destined for oblivion. And so you could kind of see something like this as arguably at least part of what would happen in Calvinism. So
Yeah,
we
it
get
does seem a little Calvinistic based on your description of it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, not for the elect, they do fine, but yeah,
Yeah, right.
the other puny inhabitants of earth that displease the creator or what have you, yeah, they don't fare so well. That seems to be what's happening here. He also does something kind of similar, although not as dramatic, with a snowman in a much later strip. So he basically makes the snowman prostrate before him. He's saying, "As I created you, so can I destroy you. You must bow before me." And of course, Susie creams him with a snowball, which we could say knocks him off his pedestal a little bit. Because
Yeah,
we call him a fallen god at this point,
I
which is
suppose.
yeah, which is ironic since in real life, sort of, many fallen angels were actually relatives of Susie's.
Well, yeah, real life is one way of putting it, I guess. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's maybe overstating a little bit, but yeah, I
yeah.
assume I'm sure you remember the strip I'm talking about. They see a snow angel, and then
And then a
and
bunch of
what
others.
conclusion do they end up drawing about this?
Well, so they're all in Susie's yard. And also, first of all, there's a bunch of them. So Hobbes, I believe, it might have been Calvin, concludes that God must have been punting angels left and right.
Hunting
Because
angel left and
because and that they burn up in the atmosphere, but and I guess they made it far enough to still leave an impression in the snow. And then they figure these must be relatives of Susie's because they're all in her yard.
yeah, I mean, decent chain of reasoning, right? I mean that must be what explains.
Can't think of any other explanation.
Yeah. So that makes it ironic, I think, that Calvin becomes metaphorically a fallen god brought about by someone who's related to so many fallen angels.
Yeah, that is interesting.
All right. Now, most of the time, though, Calvin isn't trying to be God, which is good. And we'll just theological point out there. If you're a human being, don't try to be God. That never ends well. So maybe try to be like God. Don't try to be him. That's
Yeah,
usually that's a path to destruction, it turns out. But he does seem usually to believe in God. And so we see him praying on some occasions, although mainly this takes the form of pleading for something he wants. And can you think of any examples of this?
Well, sure. And I like this phrase. I had a friend who referred to this type of prayer as believing in God as some sort of benevolent genie, and that maybe
Okay.
that's not the right way to think of it. But yeah, so the one that immediately came to my mind was in a test at school. He got a question, didn't know the answer, and so you see him praying a gas mask, a smoke grenade, and a helicopter. That's all I ask. So,
Right.
you know,
Which
asking for things to get him out of this bad situation.
exactly. Now, we don't see what happens after that. I presume he does not get any of those things, though.
Probably not.
Yeah, he doesn't seem to usually get the things he prays for. So in one case, also at school, he rips his pants on the playground at recess, and then he seems to make it back to his desk without incident, but he's afraid he'll get called to demonstrate a problem at the chalkboard. And so we see him praying like, oh, please don't let the teacher call on me. Don't let me be embarrassed by that. Please don't let this happen. And then, of course, Miss Wormwood calls on him, and we get in
Yep.
trouble. Well, so much for my ever joining the clergy.
That
But
whole arc just makes me laugh, and I won't go into the details here for the sake of time, but listeners, you ought to look that one up. It's hilarious.
that is a very good one. I will say too, I also think it's interesting how appropriate Miss Wormwood's name is at this point.
Mm.
And now you know who she's named after.
Yeah. She's named after the apprentice devil in C.S. Lewis's The Screw Tape Letters.
Right. And so even though, I mean, that's kind of a funny name, I don't think we should read Miss Wormwood as trying to tempt and corrupt Calvin. It is interesting that she's kind of the direct cause of him saying he's never going to join the clergy now, or like, you know,
Hmm.
being mad at God or pulling away from God in this way. I mean, it's sort of a coincidence in one sense, but I think it's a funny one because oh yeah, the person named after the devil character is parting Calvin from the divine in this way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good
So
point.
yeah, again, probably not an intentional reference, but it's kind of a fun one. There's another one related to school, although this is when Calvin realizes he's forgotten to do his homework. And just like you said with the other one, this is actually part of a whole arc that's really funny. And the lead up to
Mhm.
when he realizes this is great, both before and after he forgets about his homework. But because of this, he says, I suddenly feel very religious because he desperately needs a snow day so he won't have to go to school. And Hobbes calls this another deathbed conversion.
Mhm. Well, I also like at the end of this story arc, or towards the end of it, he's in school, still having not done his homework, despite having had a snow day, and the bell rings just in time. And Miss Wormwood says she'll collect the homework the next day. And Calvin turns to Susie and says, "Susie, quick, am I sitting in a beam of light?" And Susie says, "More like a puddle of sweat." Why? It's
Yeah,
another religious theme there. He was saved possibly by divine intervention here.
that's right. So this arc, so these two instances are the one time in the strip I can think of where maybe his prayers are answered. It at least he seems to attribute it to it or consider the possibility. So at least what he prays for does in fact happen.
Right.
Usually that's not the case though. So we have during the propeller beanie arc, another classic. This is a case where he tries to bargain with God, and this also takes place in school, but it's not really about school. We see him praying, begging that his propeller beanie will come today, and it's oh, I'll never ask for anything again. I'll never do anything bad if only this is the day my propeller beanie comes. I'll be perfect. I'll never do this. Okay, well, and you can guess what happens.
Yep. The beanie
Yep.
does not come.
It does not come. And then we get this shot of Calvin on his front porch saying, "What's it take, huh?" Yelling up at the heavens, which is interesting. I mean, obviously this is meant to be funny, but it I think it's also intriguing in terms of sort of theology in general and the historical Calvin. So you mentioned your friend's description of the thought of God as a sort of benevolent genie that you pray for and ask for things. And I think that's a sadly kind of common view that people have, either consciously or maybe more likely subconsciously. They start to think of God this way. Well, the purpose of God is to give me things that I ask for. And I'll just suggest that that's probably a fairly impoverished way of thinking about divinity. So
Agreed.
whether you are a religious believer or not, if you think of this concept of sort of a creator of the universe who may have some kind of personal stake or relationship with human beings, if you think of being like that is reduced to something of this sort, like that's the way to interact with that being, I think something has gone wrong with your outlook there. I would just suggest that.
Yeah, I won't spend too much time on that either, but I'll just say I see it a little bit fairly similar to the relationship of a parent and child, where a parent's job isn't to give the child everything they want. In fact, the parent's job is not to give the child absolutely everything they want, because that would be bad for them.
Right.
The parent's not at the beck and call, and the parent does love the kid, but it's not giving the kid everything they want is actually a manifestation of that love.
Exactly. I mean, if we saw this occurring or heard about it, we think, oh, that's terrible parenting. What are they? And not just in the sense of the parent, but in the effect on the child. It's like, well, that's going to be very bad for them, like you were saying. So yeah, I think it's interesting from that perspective too, and also again to take it back to historical Calvinism, because if you are ascribing to predestination, this is certainly what John Calvin would have said. The question, what does it take? It's just the question itself is out of place. There's nothing that it could take. So life is not a matter of I need to do certain things so that God will do X. It's that doesn't come into play at all. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say even outside of Calvinism, that's what should I be doing to live in a way that is illuminating, or without getting too much into it. This is the brief sort of philosophical suggestion about how this might be looked. There's another case in which Calvin also tries to bargain with God. And again, we see a similar theme. Now, this is just one strip. This is about snow, or particularly the lack of snow. So Calvin's outside, I think, with the sled, praying that it would slow. And, he tries to negotiate this, right? So it's, first, just a foot, okay, how about just 8 inches, or no, only 6, that's all I need. And then of course, nothing ever happens. And again, this ends with him kind of looking up at the heavens. Do you want me to become an atheist? And so again, it's the same idea. It's like, well, believing in God is about having God do what he wants. And again, we should say Calvin's a 6-year-old. So Right. So we should also keep that in mind. And just like with your parent metaphor before, we hope that eventually kids will become more mature and have a better outlook about certain things. So we can keep that in mind. We're not trying to be too hard on poor Calvin here, but this is how his perception of God seems to work in certain ways. One just final point on this, which I'll say, and this one's maybe a little more relatable. Mo, the bully, punches Calvin off the swings. And then at the end, a very worse for wear, Calvin says, it's hard to be religious when certain people are never incinerated by bolts of lightning.
Yeah, I feel that, Calvin. But, although I will say, probably if you look at just about anyone from someone's perspective, they would feel like that person deserves to be incinerated by a bolt of lightning. Maybe more rightly so in some cases than others, but point being, probably none of us is guiltless.
And that seems like a theologically sound position. None of us is guiltless. We can, I think that's interesting too. And even to bring it back to Calvin specifically. So Calvin, I think justifiably thinks Mo is just a garbage person. I mean, Mo doesn't seem to have any redeeming qualities in particular, but there's at least some instances where I think Susie could probably say, man, Calvin's such a jerk. He's so awful. And I don't think she would wish for him to be incinerated by a bolt of lightning, but I think it's fair to say she probably, at least some of the time, would think of Calvin the way that Calvin tends to think of Mo.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
But in any case, so we've talked about fate and God, and there's a couple mentions of the devil too. I think there's two occasions. What's your memory on this?
Okay, so the two that I can think of are Calvin specifically asks Hobbes if he thinks there's a devil, all supreme, whatever evil being dedicated to the temptation and destruction of man. And Hobbes says that he's not sure man needs the help. And Calvin kind of reflects on that. I don't remember exactly what he says at the end, but the other one that I can remember is Calvin tells Mom that he sold his soul to the devil that afternoon in exchange for hitting Susie with a snowball.
Exactly. Those are the exact two I could think of too. So
Okay.
If there are others, they're not coming to mind, but those are the two we can think of. So I will add the one with Susie where he tells his mom he promised the soul to the devil. It's also that he did it just when it counted. So he misses a whole bunch and she kind of taunts him. Well, if it weren't for gravity, you couldn't even hit the ground. And then he smacks her right then. Like, yeah, I did it right when it counted. And so,
Yeah.
bad news, Mom. I promised my soul to the devil this afternoon. And I would just have to say on that one, even as a kid, that one always struck me as kind of disturbing in a way, just how flippant the exchange is. It kind of, I don't know, I'm sure it's not meant to be serious, obviously, but kind of think like, man, that's
it is pretty severe.
Yeah, that's a pretty messed up thing to just casually say and joke about. And then, and his mom responds, oh, that recently? I mean, which obviously a joke, but based on how much he misbehaves. But yeah, I don't know. That's the only sort of Calvin and Hobbes strip that ever sort of disturbed me kind of in general, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's that, and the other one you mentioned that, Hobbes doesn't think man needs the help. So we don't need the help of a being just dedicated to tempting and destroying us. We're very good at being awful all on our own, which is probably true whether or not the devil actually does exist. Similarly, Calvin once asked, do you think babies are born sinful? And Hobbes says, no, I just think they're quick studies. So yeah, again, more dim view of human nature from Hobbes, which makes sense.
Sick burn, Hobbes.
Yeah, moving on though. So we talked about how Calvin usually seems to believe in God, but sometimes he has his doubts. But there's also someone else who Calvin mostly believes in, but shows doubts from time to time. And that person is Santa Claus.
Yep.
Yeah, and Santa actually plays a pretty significant role in the strip. Now, there's a couple of them where he actually appeared as a character. And so now trivia time. How many strips does Santa directly appear in?
So I was thinking about this. I saw the notes and I can think of three. So there's one where there's a poem that Calvin receives a letter from Santa saying that he prefers when kids are boorish and rude and good little kids make me sick. It's no joke. Sincerely signed, Santa. And then I awoke. So Santa briefly appears in that strip. There's the last Christmas Eve strip that we've talked about before where Santa is making his decision about Calvin, the noodle incident kid, and there's the tiger who vouches for the kid's character, says he tries to be good if he's not tempted otherwise.
Sort of good.
Sort of good, yes, that's right. and then there's one where Calvin throws a snowball, presumably at Susie. It's someone off screen, I think, and gets her. And then he's imagining Santa. So you see like a thought bubble with Santa's face above his head. Those are the only three I can think of.
Okay, yeah, and that's what I would have said too. There's those three. I thought I might trip you up on the one where he imagined Santa's face, but you got that one too. Yeah, so those are the three I can think of too. I don't think there's any others. So Santa actually appears in those three strips, but even when he doesn't, he's a very strong presence because there's always this looming aspect of Santa watching, and then a lot of Calvin's moral dilemmas and consternation come from wanting to hit Susie with a snowball in particular versus wanting to get presents from Santa. So Santa is this looming force that plays a role in what Calvin does or what he thinks he should or should not do. But like we said, he also doubts the existence of Santa at one point. And so in one in particular, he says, a lot of this Santa stuff is hard to believe. Flying reindeer, going around the world in one night, and so on. What if it's all a cruel hoax and I'm being good for nothing? And what's Hobbes' response?
You've always been good for nothing.
Yeah, which Excellent. I love Hobbes' line. I love his laughing expression as he says this, because clearly he's cracked up himself, which I think justifiably. That was a very clever comeback. And then
Yep.
also Calvin starts getting a snowball ready to throw at Hobbes. He says, well, if Santa exists, he'll forgive this one, which I would kind of agree with that. I think he might.
Yeah, Hobbes has it coming.
But yeah, so in general, Calvin struggles with this desire to do what he wants versus his desire to get presents. And he even describes this specifically in religious terms in more than one instance. So in one strip, he tells Susie that he's being good because I asked Santa for such great presents, I can withstand any temptation. I'm being an absolute angel. So he actually uses the terminology of being tempted here and having to resist temptation. And on that note, what is the amazing present that will give him the strength to withstand temptation?
I may be missing a couple adjectives here, but it's something like a heat-seeking thermonuclear smart missile.
Yeah, it's a heat-seeking missile of some kind. So yeah,
Yeah.
5 babies with one of those things will make up for this whole rotten month. Yeah, we
Yep.
talked before about how this seems to be what Calvin asked for mostly, weapons, which we don't think he actually gets. I mean, I
Other
guess we
than
don't.
snowballs.
Yeah, he did get snowballs as a weapon, but he never, to our knowledge, gets the missiles and bombs and flamethrowers and things he asked for. He still
Does
seems to
seem
be
unlikely.
happy about Christmas, which is good. But
Right.
yeah, so the prospect of getting a heat-seeking guided missile gives him the strength to withstand any temptation. Okay, and in another occasion, he also talks about being tempted. So, and this one's interesting too, because not only does he talk about being tempted, he actually thinks that the reason it snowed is for the purpose of tempting him. He says, "Oh, the snow is here. We got snow to tempt me into hitting Susie with a slush ball." And then forfeiting all my presents. So again, he tells Hobbes, to evaluate my character, my immediate pleasure is being pitted against my future greed. And what's Hobbes' response here?
Poor Susie.
Poor Susie. It's not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, it pretty much is though.
Yeah, I mean, we can, again, Hobbes has a good reason for saying this. Calvin does not have a good track record of resisting the temptation to throw slush balls at Susie, but again, more hilarity from Hobbes. Now, there's two other noteworthy things about this strip, though. So, like I said, Calvin sees this as a test that is being deliberately foisted upon him. So it's not like sort of impartial circumstances of nature that cause him to be tested in this way. It's like, no, nature is doing this for the purpose of testing Calvin. So it's interesting how like targeted and specific to him he sees this. But also, he doesn't really frame it in terms of good or bad. So when we think about resisting temptation, usually we think, I have to resist the urge to do this bad thing and instead choose to do this good thing. But what Calvin actually says is that his immediate pleasure is being pitted against future greed, which that also seems like something bad, or at least
Kind of
it's
like
not,
bad versus different bad.
yeah, it's at least not obviously good. And so I find that kind of fascinating too. So he doesn't really frame it as a moral choice. It's putting off immediate pleasure for a greater pleasure later. So Calvin does talk about resisting temptation in this way, but again, it seems to have more to do with the future presence that he wants versus the desire to misbehave in the short term.
Right.
Now, on that point, Calvin's pretty self-reflective about this process. So the sled rides serve a similar function to the wagon ride, in that in winter they often have discussions on deep thoughts when they're going down the cliff. Usually go off a cliff too at the end of this,
Yeah.
with the wagon. Okay, but in this case, Calvin's talking about this idea of trying to be good to get presents. And he says, but I've been wondering, is it truly being good if the only reason I behave well is so I can get more loot at Christmas? I mean, really, all I'm doing is saying I can be bribed, which is kind of true. And this circles around nicely to the other time that Calvin questions the existence of Santa. So we talked about one briefly before, but there's actually a whole story arc around this that appears in Yukon Ho. So this isn't a super long story arc, but I think there's a lot of depth to it. So I'm sure you remember the one that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, he's questioning Santa, all the things that are suspect about the existence of Santa and why is Santa so secretive and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, and very reasonable questions, and probably the kinds of questions children naturally start to ask when they're around Calvin's age. It's like, okay, well, really, is this really true? And he starts to say, all right, well, like you said, if Santa's real, like, why all the secrecy? If the guy exists, why doesn't he ever show himself and prove it? And if he doesn't exist, what's the meaning of all this? And Hobbes replies, well, I don't know. Isn't this a religious holiday? And Calvin replies, yeah, but actually, I've got the same questions about God. So before, I mean, we talked about there's kind of an implicit parallel between belief in Santa and belief in God. And now this is made explicit. So I was like, well, yeah, actually, I have these exact questions about God. And through the rest of this story arc, we also get this parallel. Santa's kind of a stand-in for God conceptually here, even though he doesn't talk about God directly for the rest of
Right.
it. So, yeah, so he wonders, oh, well, maybe since I doubted the existence of Santa, maybe that itself will make Santa mad, and now I'm on the bad list. And Hobbes says, I think if you weren't on the bad list already, this probably wouldn't have pushed you over.
Right. What do you
Yeah.
mean on the bad list already?
Yeah, so Calvin takes exception to this now, but I'm curious, what do you think, Ryan? Because do you read this as Hobbes like sort of making a joke at Calvin's expense, or is he genuinely trying to be helpful?
I actually, with that one, if I'm recalling it correctly, I think Hobbes was trying to be helpful, like don't worry about it. You were already on the bad list anyway, sort of a thing, and didn't mean it as a slight, but it totally was.
Yeah, I agree actually. I always read that as Hobbes just trying to make like a reasonable point. It's like, well, I mean, I don't think you've certainly done ostensibly worse things than this, so I
Yeah,
don't think
that's
this.
not the problem.
Yeah, that's not what Santa's getting mad about. And again, they kind of more in terms of morality than theology per se. But Calvin asks Hobbes, he says, well, do you think it matters what your actions are or what's in your heart? And Hobbes says, well, I think our actions show what's in our heart.
Yeah.
Yeah, to which Calvin says, I resent that, which again, it's funny, but I think it's an important point too.
Yeah,
It's deeper than just the joke there.
right.
Okay. But in any case, so Calvin is debating on whether he believes in Santa or not. But then he finally comes to a decision on that. He makes a conclusion, and what is that?
He says that he'll believe anything they want if it, he's not willing to risk his presence over this. So, however preposterous it sounds, he's willing to believe it if it gets him presence.
Exactly. So he just takes a practical approach. He goes, well, yeah, like you said, no matter how preposterous he sounds, why would I risk not getting presence over this? I'll believe anything they want. And
Yeah.
obviously, this makes sense in terms of the strip, but I also find it interesting because it's essentially a version of a famous philosophical argument that's called Pascal's wager. This was an argument by a 17th century philosopher, Blaise Pascal, about belief in God. And like Calvin here, this isn't supposed to show evidence or a reason to believe God exists. Instead, it's designed to show that believing in God is the only rational choice someone could make. And so here's the sort of short version of it. So Pascal says, okay, so you can choose to believe in God or you can choose not to believe in God. Those are your two options. And then either God exists or God doesn't exist. Those are the other two possibilities.
Right.
Okay, so if we think about what's going on here, then he says, all right, well, if you believe in God and God does exist, then you get an infinite gain. So
Right.
you have life in heaven, eternal bliss. So, okay, infinite reward. Now, if you don't believe in God and he does exist, then you get infinite loss because you lose out on that potential infinite reward.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then on the other side, let's say you don't believe in God. Well, then you gain a little earthly pleasure, but you lose out on the infinite reward again if God does exist. But if you don't believe in God and then he doesn't exist, then you gained a little bit of earthly reward. So he says, well, since we don't know which of these is the case, whether God exists or not, then it would be foolish to risk an infinite reward for just a finite gain of these temporary earthly pleasures. So the only thing that makes sense is to believe in God. Okay, so that's Pascal's wager. I mean, in a nutshell, and it sure sounds a lot like what Calvin's saying about Santa here, doesn't it? I mean, Calvin's
Yeah.
is more simplified, but the overall point is the same.
I'm
And
not going to risk
also,
eternal salvation. I'm not going to risk presence. Yeah, same idea.
yeah, and interestingly, Hobbes's reaction to Calvin is essentially what a lot of people have said about Pascal's wager. So what's Hobbes' reaction to this conclusion by Calvin?
Is that where he's like that? It's a very cynical way to approach the idea or something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think he says, "How enterprisingly cynical of you."
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, which fair, and that's the kind of objection that is typically leveled against Pascal's wager. So, well, this is just cynical. The other thing is that this isn't how belief works. Like you can't just decide to believe something. That's not a real belief. And also that God probably wouldn't be fooled by this. So I remember even reading one article where someone was saying like, I think God would take particular pleasure in zapping people who try to pull this kind of thing, like, oh, you just choose now you believe just because you don't want to risk something, right? So that's it's not real. God wouldn't be fooled. It's cynical, etc. Which are all fair points. Interestingly, though, so Pascal was aware of all this and actually brought this up himself, which I find intriguing. So Pascal's version wasn't just like Calvin's in this sense. He said, "Yeah, this isn't really belief. You wouldn't really believe if you do this." But Pascal says, by doing this and living a life as a believer and doing these things like going to services or engaging in prayer, that sort of thing, you may actually come to develop real belief over time. And so what Pascal is saying is it's not just the wager and then you're done. Oh, okay, well, I sure want this reward, so I'm going to pretend to believe whatever I want. He's saying, no, this is something that would be good anyway. So you should do these things if for no other reason than because you get this reward. But by doing so, you may come to develop genuine belief, and that's actually a good for your life anyway. He thinks that this is actually something where you will develop into a better person and have more happiness in your life through doing this. And again, whatever our listeners' particular religious beliefs or lack thereof, I think it's just in terms of understanding what Pascal's getting at. I think that's worth pointing out because it's
For sure.
easy to dismiss this, like Hobbes does. It's just kind of a cynical, we could say cash grab for lack of a better word, but that's not what he was really doing with this. That's the starting point, not the end of it. But I also think that that's intriguing in terms of thinking back to Calvin, because again, we were saying before, he's just a 6-year-old, right? So he has maybe he's more sophisticated than a lot of 6-year-olds, but he's still a 6-year-old. So he has this, 6-year-old's way of thinking about things. So right and wrong or God or what have you, or a matter of rules that you have to follow that maybe you not like to, but we hope that as children grow, they come to see the value of doing these things for themselves. And it's no longer a matter of sort of external imposition. It's something you then grow into. So you might think from the standpoint of Calvin's parents or what have you, that this might be what's happening too. So this belief in Santa might serve a useful function in Calvin's life, even if at this point it's just cynical for the sake of presence.
Yeah, that his motive may not be pure now, but by learning to do the good things, he might learn that those good things are rewarding in and of themselves and become a better person for it, sort of a thing.
Right, which is a lot of the point of philosophy itself. We hope that through learning and questioning and loving wisdom, we'll become better people.
Yeah.
That being said, that's been a lot about Calvin, specifically in relation to his namesake. So we touched on God and predestination in particular here. I think that's a good stopping point, at least for this sort of heavier portion of this episode. But now maybe we'll just talk about a few sort of miscellaneous fun things.
All right.
And yeah, here's sort of a trivia question, I guess. There's actually I believe, only one time in which an actual excerpt from a philosophical work appears in the strip. Do you know where that was?
I mean,
Or maybe you can guess, even if you're not sure.
well, so I don't really know anything about philosophical works, but something about metaphysics comes to mind.
That's true. Okay, so that's one. So Calvin's dad tries to put him to sleep by reading him readings on dialectical metaphysics. So that's
Okay.
I don't know that that's a real philosophical title, but the record
Okay. So we're
metaphysics.
looking.
There's an excerpt from a work which, even if you don't know where it's from, you might be able to guess that that's actually from a philosophy work. Can you think of what that
Oh,
might?
oh, um, there's one where Calvin is copying Hobbes, like playing the imitation game or whatever, and Hobbes starts reading something that's like, "We can a priori and prior to something, something, something," and that throws Calvin off from being able to continue copying Hobbes.
Exactly. So this is how Hobbes vanquishes the incredibly annoying human echo that copies everything people say. So
Yeah.
yeah, the actual quote is, "We can a priori and prior to all given objects have a knowledge of those conditions on which alone experience of them is possible, but never of the laws to which things may in themselves be subject without reference to possible experience."
We
Which
can Peoria something something.
exactly. So yeah, as you can imagine, Calvin has a little bit of difficulty just repeating that. Yeah, Hobbes reads this out of a book, which in my own head canon, I'm going to say maybe is Readings on Dialectical Metaphysics, that same book that Calvin's dad
Okay.
at that time. I don't know if Watterson had that in mind, but it could be.
Seems
But
plausible.
yeah, but I think that's funny that actually makes an appearance. This is actually an excerpt from the work of Immanuel Kant. I've probably in the Critique of Pure Reason, but he's talking about what are the grounds for experiencing anything, like what is required for our minds to be able to experience things, and he's talking about the distinction between things as they are versus things as we're capable of perceiving them. Anyway, we won't go too much into that, but
Yeah,
that's
I think my brain just exploded.
yeah, so it's funny too because Kant is kind of notoriously hard to understand. So I had a professor once who said that he knew 10 people who claimed to understand Kant and he believed 5 of them. So take of
It
that what you will. So but
makes me think of a it makes me think of a professor who was teaching quantum mechanics and said, right now I'm the only one here who doesn't understand quantum mechanics, but by the end of the semester, all of you will not understand quantum mechanics."
that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so right. So as a philosopher, I just think that's funny. It's like, wow, an actual excerpt from a philosophical work gets put in there. That's pretty funny. Another reference is this doesn't directly mention the philosopher, but there's one case where Calvin gets worried about what people might call them. Do you remember what that is?
Oh, a peripatetic peripatetics. I love that one. I don't
Exactly.
know what it means, but I love it.
Yeah. So I remember first reading it, I didn't know what it meant either. Now I know that the Peripatetics were a group of philosophers and they had a habit of walking around as they discussed things. So arguably, Calvin and Hobbes are peripatetics. I don't know, I won't call them pathetic, but the peripatetic does fit. So yeah, again, kind of a weird reference to philosophy, not a philosophical concept per se, but a group. But another thing I think is funny, I also like Hobbes's reactions of, I don't think most people take the time to rhyme weird insults.
But shouldn't we have a ready retort?
Yeah, I mean, Calvin's just planning in case
Yeah.
anyone ever does say.
Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Well, you just remember what you said because in a few hours I'll have a witty and blistering retort. Boy, you'll be sorry then.
That's right. Yeah, he talks about how he can't think of retorts on the spot. So that makes sense. You tie these
Yeah,
together, he knows he needs to have the comeback ready in advance or it won't happen.
exactly.
Yeah. And maybe just one more, and to bring us sort of full circle. So we've talked a lot about some grand and big ideas about the point of existence, whether there's meaning in life and so forth. And this brings us to a snowman. So Calvin does this more than once, but in one strip in particular, I'm thinking of, he first sort of criticizes the soulless banality of just an ordinary snowman he sees. And then he shows Hobbes his snowman, which he calls the torment of existence weighed against the horror of non-being. And then you get this, imagine if you know the painting The Scream by Munch.
Yeah.
Imagine sort of that, but tuned up to 12, essentially. So you get this kind of big face with arms and this grotesque sort of scream, like, ah!
Yeah, I think I mistakenly called that bourgeois buffoon in the winter episode. And yeah, that's a different sculpture, but the one you're talking about is a really good grotesque face.
Yeah, and I mean, if you had to visually represent the torment of existence weighed against the horror of non-being, I mean, that evokes it pretty well, I think.
I agree.
Yeah. So again, a lot of big philosophical themes in Calvin and Hobbes, some much more serious, this in a more light way, of course. But I think that's probably a good place to stop for now. On that note, though, listeners, if you can think of philosophical themes or other strips that what we talked about today reminded you of, feel free to email us. You can reach us at magiccandh@proton.me.
And I get to do this part today, as always. This podcast is ad-free, free of charge. You can get it without any strings attached. This is all about celebrating Calvin and Hobbes together, and we hope you'll come along with us for the ride.
Exactly. Let's go exploring.
You've been listening to The Magic of Calvin and Hobbes, a fan celebration. We'll be releasing 40 episodes all throughout the year, from November 18th, 2025 to November 18th, 2026, to celebrate the 40th anniversary. Our intro and outro music is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, referenced in the Calvin and Hobbes strip published on October 8, 1986. This rendition was performed by the Skidmore College Orchestra and made available under a Creative Commons license on museopen.com. We hope you'll join us next episode for more fun.